Again, thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, reactions, thoughts, and ideas at the end of this presentation. So just to start, this is a presentation. I am going to be talking about self-regulation and interventions across development, and I'm going to try and throw out some considerations for American Indian and Alaskan Native children and youth. What I want to say sort of preliminary to that, because I have spoken with others who find the term self-regulation sounds very individualistic and internal to individuals. And I am going to talk a little bit about what I mean by self-regulation and why I think that it actually can be a useful term and a useful construct. So I want to just highlight that from the get-go, but also to say that the way I'm going to be talking about self-regulation today is as something that really only exists within relationships with others, particularly relationships with caregivers, and that the way that children develop self-regulation is very dependent on those relationships as well as the environment. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that. And I wanted to do some acknowledgments of my team. As you may have noticed, there was an acknowledgment of Duke on the initial slide, which is where this work started, and I have since moved to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, but I have several colleagues at Duke who were very much involved in our development and thinking around this, and Alita Meyer, who some of you may know from Administration of Children and Families, who we've worked with closely, and then the team from the Native Children's Research Exchange, including Monica, Michelle, as well as Josh Sparrow, and some funding we received through the through the OPRA office. So where I'm going to go today during the sort of formal presentation time, I'm going to tell you about this model of self-regulation development in context that we've been working on. And the way we've sort of put that all together is with 7 principles for thinking about how kids develop self-regulation and all the contextual processes that are built in around that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some ways that culture really intersect with and influence self-regulation. I will share a little bit about some findings from a review of the literature of self-regulation interventions that we have done, because I think it's useful when we're talking about this to know what the evidence base really is. And then again, I will also have some thoughts and ideas around how this applies to children in Native communities. And then I'll finish up with some ideas around programs and practice, delivery, training, some of those sorts of things. So I said there are 7 principles, and here is the first one. The first one has to do with why self-regulation is important. And there's really been increasing recognition of this, I would say, in the last 10 to 20 years, really about how foundational self-regulation is to well-being across a number of different domains, from mental, emotional, physical. You could go broader than that. Some things I think are worth pointing out is that when we talk about physical health, and we know more and more how closely connected physical health is with mental and emotional health and stress in particular, that certainly has to do with things like preventing diabetes, substance use, suicide, things that have been concerns in many tribal communities. I think self-regulation is also foundational in terms of thinking about resilience in the face of racism, discrimination, cultural genocide, and historical trauma. that many American Indian and Native children have experienced. So I think it's relevant in that regard as well. And the other reason I think is that it's important is that we do know, and we have a good database for supporting how responsive self-regulation is to interventions, and a huge range of interventions. We'll be talking about that in the second half of my talk. And so I do think it's something that's relevant for a number of programs to be thinking about for supporting their communities and the families that they work with. So the way we think about self-regulation, there's a lot of terms. There's a lot of different overlapping terms, and it can be confusing. And if you start looking online or looking at the literature, it's very easy to kind of get confused about, well, is this the same thing as this thing? There's a lot of these words that sound alike. So the way that we think of self-regulation and why actually we think that's a useful term to use, one of the reasons we think it's a useful term to use, is sort of thinking about it as an umbrella term for a lot of these different pieces. There's pieces related to emotion regulation. There's pieces related to executive functioning. Some people like the term grit. Some people don't like the term grit. Effortful control, self-control. All of these things are related. For the most part, I would say that they tend to be narrower than the way we think about self-regulation. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why that is. But right now, the pieces I want to highlight is that self-regulation is a lot more than just controlling impulses. It's a lot more than self-control. It very much has to do with the flexibility and adaptability that someone has in response to all the demands, expectations, and stressors that might be placed upon them from what's going on in their environment, in their school, in their community. And so I think self-regulation is actually something that can be very empowering to individuals and communities. Some constructs that I think are related to self-regulation, which many of you may be familiar with, have to do with things like resilience. I mentioned that before, but also coping, stress management, even goal attainment, although goal attainment tends to be, I would say, a little bit narrower than what we think of with self-regulation. But these are related types of things. So now let me give you more formal definition now that I've previewed it. So the way that we've been defining self-regulation, and we spent quite a while and talked to a lot of people to kind of arrive at a definition that we felt like was captured what we thought was important, is this idea that self-regulation is an action. We were very intentional about that word, the act of managing cognition and emotion. There are other definitions of self-regulation that you will find that talk about self-regulation as being a capacity, which is something that sounds and I think is much more internal to an individual than the way we're thinking about self-regulation, is that it really only exists, again, in relationship to others and the environment. And so in that way, it's about the action. We included both this cognitive component and emotional component. We see cognitive regulation and emotional regulation as sort of foundational for goal-directed actions related to behavior, yes, including impulses, but also including this much more proactive, problem-solving, constructive sort of actions as well. I do think this connects very well with supporting community goals related to well-being. Why do I say that? Because it really is about how you manage your thoughts and how you manage your emotions together, and how those things work together to really support kids being attached to caregivers, individuals being attached to their community, and supporting compassion that influences positive goals. level 3 is about many different influences on self-regulation. And the first thing that I want to point out here is that we've created this series of concentric circles that look like starts with sort of what might be most internal to a child or an individual, and sort of goes outwards towards more environmental influences. But what's really important is that each of those levels, each of those factors actually influence each other. So I'm going to give you some examples of that, but I wanted to just make a note first off. So if we start sort of with some of the internal factors, that has to do, and most of us can probably think about this, there certainly are differences in kids' biology, in their genetics, and in their temperament. Some kids just simply have a harder time doing this than others. At the same time, as I noted, there can be influences in the environment, particularly stress, which I will be talking about shortly, which can actually create changes in brain structure and function. And so in that way, the outermost circle can actually end up impacting the innermost circle. Similarly, we certainly know that kids' biology and then their behaviors, those can have an impact on caregivers and others in the environment. So it very much can be an interaction. I hope you're getting that flavor. If we look at the next circle, skills, this is an important factor because this is often where we think about targeting interventions. These are the skills that a child or youth has developed over time that helps them self-regulate. And I'll talk in a minute about why we actually think of these things as skills, which is actually helpful if you're thinking about interventions. The next level is motivation. And there can be motivation that is internally driven. So, for example, the values or the goals that an individual has. There can be motivation that's provided by external sorts of things. Rewards and consequences can be external motivation. One of the important things to think about here is how motivation and skills might interact. So you can have a child that actually has a good bit of skills. They know what to do in a particular situation. They know how to keep themselves organized. They actually can control their behavior when they need to, but perhaps they have no motivation to do so in a particular situation. This may be something that comes more into play with adolescents. I think most of you work with younger kids, but sometimes that dynamic can occur. The reverse can occur too. So we may have some kids who actually are very motivated. They very much want to please their teacher. They want to please their parent. However, if they have not developed the skills to do whatever it is they're being asked, to sit still, to wait, then in fact, despite having a high level of motivation, they may not be able to self-regulate in that particular situation. So those things are very much interact. The next circle has to do with caregiver support, which is also a really critical piece of our model that I'll be talking about much more. And when I say caregiver, I mean that could be parents, it could be teachers, it could be mentors, it could even be program staff depending on where you are in your organization. So please, whenever I say caregiver, keep in mind that it can be a number of different types of individuals who are functioning in a caregiver role. When we start to talk about adolescents, we could even think about situations where peers provide some support. Of course, some of you can think about situations where peers actually are not helpful to their friends in self-regulation, so it probably works both ways. But for younger kids, we're probably thinking mostly about caregivers. And then finally, we're thinking about the environment. And the environment certainly includes culture. It includes values and beliefs that guide how one will live one's life. And those are things that can, I mentioned earlier how environmental stress can have a negative impact on self-regulation. In those same sort of environmental contexts, as well as caregiver support, also can serve in a buffering role. So that's one of the reasons they're on the outside of the circle, is because when there are things going on in the environment, caregivers can actually be a buffer between the stress in the environment and the child. And then simultaneously, when the environment is really supportive, if there are other aspects in this circle that are weaker or that need more support, the environment can help build that up. So a couple of implications. Well, the most important implication is that self-regulation really is embedded in culture and relationships, at least the way that we think about it. Self-regulation, I put it in quotes here, and hopefully you have a sense of why I did that based upon how I've been talking about it. But it really is about how one's values and beliefs guides behavior in relationship to other and in being responsible to others. And those are things that all the caregivers I mentioned really are responsible and have a role for instilling those principles in young kids, certainly in particular. And I mentioned some of the peer norms and culture and how those may come into play as well. And I would just make a comment that I'm referring mostly to children here, but this is really equally applicable to us as adults. If you all want to reflect for a moment about the last time that you may have felt very stressed about something at work or in another context, and whether there was somebody in your own life that you felt close with or supported by who actually helped you regulate your emotions and your thoughts, your decision-making, your problem-solving in that situation. So actually, self-regulation is something that we're focusing on today in terms of kids developing, but it really is something that is lifelong, that we all work on, and for whom those who are close and supportive around us really will always continue to play an important role. In terms of tribal communities, I think there are cultural practices around self-regulation that Dr. Saplakai has done some nice work in this area, and she may comment on that during the Q&A time, really in terms of thinking about what are some of those practices that exist and have existed for many years as traditional practices, which actually may be very supportive of self-regulation. So things like spirituality and dance, coming-of-age ceremonies, rites of passage, many of those things certainly have aspects of them that are very aligned with the way we think about self-regulation. So things related to creating a life path in consulting with elders, for example, practices that really teach patience and self-discipline, practices that foster a sense of identity and belonging, and that really require focus and persistence, which are absolutely part of the critical pieces of self-regulation. So I think there are a lot of these things that certainly seem like they ought to be related and connected. I think we'll talk later that the research in this area to make that connection and support that connection is pretty limited at this point, and Dr. Saplakai is one of the few folks who sort of started really looking at some data to see how these things might be connected. And I'll come back to that because I think that's a really important point. But I want to make one more that Dr. Saplakai has also made in some of her work, which is about how native language may have a really important role in terms of supporting self-regulation development, and in particular thinking about how there may be ways of regulating emotions and behavior through native language that actually don't even exist in English, and that there may be aspects of that that are particularly beneficial for cognitive development even. Okay, so moving on with Principle 4, and this goes back to the point I was making about self-regulation being something that we think of in terms of skills that can be developed and skills that it can actually be taught. And one of the metaphors that we've found useful is the metaphor of literacy. So we know that there are many different subcomponents or subskills of literacy, just like self-regulation is not any one thing. Hopefully at this point you have a flavor of all the different components that may be involved with emotion regulation, with cognitive regulation. We know that literacy develops earlier and benefits in a supportive context, just like self-regulation does. We also know, and I would say, is that just like with literacy, we know if, for example, a child has not acquired the skills that you may have thought they should when they're young, that is not a reason to think that they can't develop those skills later. That's, for example, keeping with our literacy metaphor, that's why we have adult literacy programs, that those skills can be taught later on, even if there are gaps in the learning that occur early on for whatever reason, and usually there's good reasons when those gaps occur. So really thinking about there being multiple intervention opportunities, and again, self-regulation being something that can be learned. And the last point being that because kids are always there's always going to be individual differences and temperamental differences. Some kids are always going to need more support and instruction than others, and we know that, and we just like with reading. And we know, like with reading, it's really would be unfair to think that doing a 12-week reading program in school when a child is 7 would be adequate for their lifelong literacy. I would say the same is true for self-regulation. There's absolutely no reason to think that coming in with a 12-week program for self-regulation is going to teach lifelong skills, because, in fact, skills are things that build over time and develop as we get older and face new demands and develop new skills to deal with those new demands. And you could probably think of some examples even, let's say, from when a child moves from preschool to elementary school, how there's new skills that are needed, and in fact most kids do develop. Same thing from elementary school to middle school, for example. I've given you some examples of these, but just to highlight really the breadth of skills that we're talking about and some variation in what those look like between younger kids and older youth. So with younger kids, we may be, if we're teaching skills, we may be really focusing in on things like identifying feelings, expressing feelings. That's pretty foundational and pretty important, and when we want to teach kids to calm down. Teaching waiting and persisting are really critical skills. That's the delay of gratification, or keep continuing to try when things get difficult. Even for young kids, we start some problem solving. We can do that with preschoolers, even if it's in a simplistic way of saying, I have a problem and now I'm going to come up with a solution. I'm going to be a good solution detective. Of course, as they get older and as kids move towards adolescence, we start to think about all the different variations of evaluating consequences and much more complex problems, of course. Organization, and then also really this piece of sort of tuning in to other people, and so that perspective taking, that empathy that serves as the foundation for compassion and builds community. Oops, wrong direction. Okay, Principle 5. So I've said several times about how our understanding of self-regulation is that it is very much embedded in co-regulation, and I could have drawn that in a circle as well. And the way we talk about that is those relationships is as co-regulation is the term we use. We're not the first folks who've used that term. You can find that in the literature in different ways. But we're talking about it in a way that really connects with the whole idea of developing self-regulation. So really thinking about co-regulation as an interactional process. So it's where that caregiver provides, and there's two key components here, and both of these are important. Both of these really need to be in place. One is the warmth and nurturing and responsive relationship. So that responsiveness has to do with really tuning in to the child, that serve and return idea that some of you may be familiar with, mirroring and expanding upon the child's expression and the child's actions and speech. But then there's this other piece too, which has to do with the support, coaching, and modeling. So really almost a teaching, but more than a simple telling a child what they should be doing, but really coaching. And I will describe this in a bit more detail in a little bit. But this idea of coaching is probably the best term and the best way of describing it. That really helps a child understand, express, and modulate their feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. So all three of those components. And just like I said earlier with that slide with all the concentric circles, just like the caregivers can buffer and teach skills to kids as well as motivate kids, of course, we know that it can be a two-way street, and kids can also impact their parents' regulation. Those of you who work with families of challenging kids probably know that very well. And that's actually an important point, and one that will be relevant in terms of thinking about what types of supports we provide to families. So to try and define this a little bit more, what are some things that a co-regulating caregiver might do? Well, I talked earlier about buffering from stress and adversity. Being a warm, responsive presence, in particular in times of distress. That's certainly true for young kids. The classic toddler grabbing the parent's leg is sort of an easy example to think about, but I would say that's really equally true as kids get older as well. Of course, they're going to express distress in different ways, but still having that parent or that caregiver present and in a responsive way is equally critical. There's this component also that certainly is, again, absolutely critical for young kids, but nonetheless relevant for adolescents, around structure and positive discipline practices, structure and consistency, actually. So, again, those of you who work in early child care settings know how regulating it can be when kids know what their schedule is, they know what will happen next. There's certain rules or certain things are okay and certain things are not okay, and they are like that on a Monday or a Wednesday. They are like that when their teacher's in a good mood or a bad mood. All that sort of consistency really contributes towards the child feeling safe and really directly contributes towards the child being able to keep themselves regulated. Again, if you think about sort of a typical preschool Head Start classroom, one of the times that kids tend to become most dysregulated is actually during transitions. So it is exactly those times when there is often less structure, less clarity about what needs to be happening. There's more waiting, and so that's when kids tend to become less regulated. There's a teaching component that I mentioned, and then this coaching component. And then to follow up on the point I made just a moment ago, how well a caregiver is able to do these things for a child is absolutely dependent on that adult's own co-regulation capacities. So I'm guessing that many of you know this all too well. Working with families, when we hope that they can provide all these types of supports I've been talking about for their kids, but there are times we know when parents can't. There are often very good reasons for that, which probably have to do with the caregiver's own level of stress and how they were supported and the skills that they developed over time. And so that's a piece that we also need to be thinking about when we're thinking about intervention. So I will get there, but I'm highlighting it because it's so important. These are just some examples of what it might actually look like if an adult is helping to co-regulate toddlers, speaking calmly. They may show the toddler what it means to take a deep breath or to smell a flower and blow out a candle, for example. They probably are spending a lot of time teaching rules. Hopefully they're spending a lot of time redirecting. Hopefully they're not doing a lot with consequences, but rather doing more teaching and redirecting. For more preschool-age kids, they may be spending more time with coaching, so they may notice situations where kids may be prompted to ask for something or prompted to walk away. They might be praised for that. They may be have some positive consequences for that. But some scaffolding in the moment, because preschoolers generally need that kind of support in the moment. And then you kind of get the idea as kids get older. You can imagine some of how that might look differently. But the same ideas are going to be true even if we're talking about a teenager or young adult. So principle 6. I think I've sort of alluded to this idea about how developmental self-regulation is. It really is something that develops over a very extended period of time. And I think we know more and more how well into young adulthood, really into mid-20s, we know now that there are a lot of brain structures and functions that are not fully developed until the mid-20s. And so we actually have some of that biological data now, which really underscores probably what most of us have known and experienced for a while. But what this graph is sort of communicating is that, so over time, we are hopefully seeing that there is an increase in the child or youth's ability to self-regulate. It's probably not completely linear. There's certainly these two periods. Yes, I have these in my red circles. These two periods of time, one that occurs in preschool and one that occurs around early adolescence in particular. There's a huge developmental growth spurt, if you will, in cognitive abilities, but where kids are more capable and adolescents are more capable of learning skills, but those are also times when emotional reactivity is very high, and so support is needed. So the idea here is that, and this is just, of course, a model. This is not database. This is mostly theoretical, but it's kind of showing you that when kids are younger, when they're toddlers, they may be able to do a few things to, let's say, distract themselves or look away in the face of stress. But for the most part, they're really dependent on caregivers to help regulate themselves. So if they're crying, if they're scared, they really need to be picked up, for example. They need to be held. Preschoolers develop more skills, but they still need an awful lot from caregivers. And that's the idea that ratio might shift over time, but that if we think about sort of self-regulation as a full bucket, that's something that, many of us still work on our buckets as we move, as we're in adulthood and middle age, and we're still working on our buckets. And in fact, that's not a bad thing, because I think having that co-regulation from those who are close to you is really has a lot of positive benefits. So Principle 7 has to do with stress. I've mentioned some concerns related to stress before. Stress is not all a bad thing. There are times when stress can be motivating, and it's very normative. And there's other stress that can be serious stress. Let's say a child runs out in front of your car, or a thief tries to grab your purse, for example. That's very stressful. That actually could be quite serious stress. But those examples, anyway, are probably going to be temporary stresses. And there's probably things that I, in that situation, could do to get support and sort of calm myself down and do what I need to do to problem solve and take care of the situation. Then there's toxic stress, and this is something that the Harvard Center for Developing Child has spent a lot of time writing about, has some great resources if this is something you're particularly interested in. We also have a report, I'll be telling you about my reports later, that dives into this whole area of stress and self-regulation. But I just wanted to kind of communicate some of the key points now. So there are times when stress is chronic or severe, when there's adverse childhood experiences, traumatic stress. When those things happen, there are times what can happen for kids is that our stress response systems get activated, and after the stress, maybe the stress never goes away, or actually even if it does, those stress levels don't go back down. And those stress hormones actually stay elevated. The stress hormones are the piece that we think can actually have some toxic effects on brain functioning, on cognitive ability, on focusing, on emotional reactivity. So when an individual has been in an environment or situation with this sort of chronic or severe stress, they can experience toxic stress. And what's going to happen in that situation is that they're probably going to be more reactive to any changes that occur in their environment, and they may be overreactive and have an overly intense reaction to something that may seem to us to be a pretty minor stress. So what you may see in that situation, I've sort of alluded to that, when you have kids or an individual who has sort of is experiencing this toxic stress, what you're going to see, the manifestation of that, are difficulties with self-regulation. They're going to have difficulty paying attention. They're going to have difficulty regulating their emotion. They're going to be dysregulated frequently, have meltdowns, may be irritable, have anger outbursts, those kinds of things. They're going to have trouble following rules, and they're going to have trouble interacting with others. And they may get stuck in these places of high alert, so stuck in this fight or flight or even a freeze mode, the freeze mode being what I think of as kids who actually really shut down and withdraw. So that's some of the way it manifests, so pretty significant, including on a biological level. We know now we have some of that data. So let's think about some of the relevance for tribal communities. Well, certainly historical trauma and poverty have made American Indian and Alaskan Native kids more vulnerable to self-regulation difficulties. I think that focusing on the co-regulation that I've been talking about, that's one way to build some of that resilience in the face of stress and really support some of the well-being. That I imagine most of your programs are focused on well-being in some shape or form. The positive news here, which I'm moving into now, is that we actually have quite a bit of evidence that these sort of negative stress effects, negative developmental trajectories that I've been talking about, those can be reversed with intervention. So even when negative effects have been experienced, those can be reversed. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so my key points, I think I'm going to move along because I'm watching my clock and I don't want to cut short the conversation around interventions and programs. You all will have access to this slide set if I skip anything. So let's think about self-regulation interventions. First off, I want to say that I'm going to be sharing here what we learned from a large literature review that we did. And I think that there are some benefits to that because the literature is quite large, and there's sort of increasing attention to some of these kinds of things, even in the media and a lot of communities. But I am going to come back to this idea of the relevance of these interventions for Native children and tribal communities, because there are some gaps there, which I think is something that all of you may have actually been struggling about, and maybe something we can touch upon during the Q&A time. So I'm going to go through this fairly briefly, but I want to at least kind of tell you where my recommendations are coming from. So what we did is I'm going straight to sort of what we found in terms of the literature. So we identified 312 studies in the literature that either said that they were an intervention that was intended to support self-regulation, or it was something that measured an outcome that we thought was a self-regulation outcome. So they didn't even have to describe themselves as doing that if they found some effects that were relevant. And so what you see here is that sort of a nice little U-curve, but most of our studies are for younger kids or middle-aged kids, if you will, and it's a nice-sized database. Most of these studies were actually randomized controlled trials, so a pretty good evidence base. The main limitation here that I will say is that out of all of these studies, there was only 4% of the studies that reported including any American, Indian, Alaskan Native participants, and only one of them that actually specifically recruited a sample of Native children. So I don't say that to say that I don't think our results are not relevant at all, but it means that the message here is that there are really very few validated and culturally relevant interventions that have actually looked at self-regulation. So sort of that gap between our Western research base and sort of more traditional practices, which is something I will come back to. So just a flavor in terms of what are some of those interventions that we saw. For infants and toddlers, we saw a lot of home visiting programs. Some of you may be familiar with the ABC program, Child First PAL. Those were some of the interventions. Preschool interventions, very well-established parenting programs, and a lot of social-emotional curricula that you all are probably familiar with, so things like PATH, The Incredible Years, Parent Core, Tools of the Mind, some of those programs, a lot of social learning and attachment theory programs. And then in elementary school, some similar kinds of things, although some diversity as well, moving into some things like mindfulness, yoga, computer attention training, and problem solving. Some of the programs you all may be familiar with are strengthening families, making choices, I can problem solve, second step, strong start. Those were some of the ones you all may recognize. What we saw in the interventions we looked at is that almost all of the interventions, there were a few exceptions, but almost all of them took one of these two approaches. So they took an approach where they were sort of working with parents through a parenting program or a home visiting program primarily, or they were teaching skills. Now, some of the studies did both, although I will say that from our review, we actually thought this was a weakness. There was not nearly as many studies as we thought perhaps ought to be focusing on both of these areas at the same time. Many studies just did one or the other, and certainly by the time you get to preschool, there certainly is some skills instruction that's relevant, but we don't want to see the co-regulation focus fall off either. And by the way, I have a slide on this at the end, but most of what I'm talking about today is published online on 3 different reports. There's a few more products that are forthcoming, but there are 3 reports, and this is one of them that is it was published earlier this year. Okay, so basically in terms of what were the effects of these interventions, the effects were positive. They were positive and they were meaningful, and there were impacts on a wide range of domains. We saw benefits in both cognitive and emotional domains, which we thought was really important. We saw impact on sort of internalizing difficulties as well as more what you might think perhaps classic externalizing symptoms, things like impulsivity and disruptive behaviors. We also saw an impact in some of the studies actually had biological measures, so things like salivary cortisol levels and showing impact on those through intervention. And really very broad impacts. And this kind of goes back to what I said at the very beginning of the talk, which is that self-regulation really is so foundational, and one of those reasons is that it impacts so many different domains. For younger kids in particular, there were really positive effects for some of the parenting programs that focused on the co-regulation, the effects on child cognitive, emotional, and behavioral self-regulation in the small to medium range. And these are primarily prevention programs, so these are not programs focused on working with sort of clinically defined populations in any way. That wasn't part of our review and our work, our definition of work with ACF. And so those are actually really positive effect sizes. Also very positive finding that in those studies that actually worked with teachers, then in fact classroom climate improved as well. So I mentioned briefly that we thought overall there were some ways in which interventions could be strengthened. Part of that had to do with some programs doing most of their focus in either the emotional domain or the cognitive domain, but not really bringing those together, and we think the bringing together and the interaction is really critical. There were, for younger kids, many programs supported and taught co-regulation, but not as many as we would have thought. So we actually feel like this is an area that programs could do more with. They could more consistently bring caregivers on board, not just try and teach skills to preschoolers themselves, but really pulling their caregivers in. And of course, this piece I've mentioned already, which is when we bring in caregivers, we also need to be thinking about how are we going to attend to caregivers' own self-regulation so that they can serve as a support for kids in the ways that we want. Many of these interventions, actually the majority of them, were actually implemented within schools. And I think there are a lot of positive things about that, but we would really like to see those interventions really be embedded, and I wouldn't say that many of the programs are embedded, so really adopted and implemented across settings and across time, which is really what we think ideally we would want to see happen. All right, so let's go back in terms of thinking about some intervention considerations for American Indian and Alaskan Native children. So I touched upon earlier on some of the potential for traditional cultural practices to support self-regulation. They have potential as interventions. That's probably not a framework that has been used, but I think a connection where there could be some potential for connecting those things with more research. I think the caveat about a lot of the interventions I've been talking about is that they have not been well studied in tribal communities with Native kids, and were they to be, and in fact many of you probably have experience with this, they probably need cultural adaptations to make sure they're really feasible, acceptable, and effective. I know that there's some work that has begun in that area, but I think it's overall still pretty limited at this point. And I also think that to make those adaptations really meaningful, that really takes community engagement, which is not an easy task. And they're concerned about buy-in, about engagement, and about potential for harm even. And so I think those are the caveats and the considerations of what I've been talking about, and again, is something that may be useful to have some Q&A around as well. Okay, so to finish up with some recommendations for programs and practices. So the first recommendation is really around building co-regulation supports in families and communities. So I've probably repeating myself now multiple times about providing a warm, responsive caregiving relationship for all children and youth. And that may look different in one culture, in one tribe from another, but I think this idea of warm and responsive may be useful, may be something that manifests or looks different. I mentioned the pieces of structure, support, and motivation for kids to learn skills, a teaching component, and a structuring of the environment in particular to help young kids manage stress. So another recommendation may be around the delivery of evidence-supported programs. I think, of course, the qualifications here is the applicability of the evidence base that I've been talking about to tribal communities and American Indian, Alaskan Native kids. And also sort of recognition that there are, I realize, different definitions of evidence. Evidence can be defined as community truths and traditions. And so, again, something that I think would be nice to see more research bringing those two things together so that culturally grounded practices are not at odds with what we think of and what sometimes funders actually mandate, sort of having programs be evidence-based. So to the extent that you all are thinking about delivering some of the programs, and again, some of you probably already do, I think one recommendation would be really thinking about outcomes. There is a lot of variability in terms of what these different programs do. Some programs actually don't find any beneficial outcomes. Others find positive outcomes. Some find outcomes in one area and not another. So for that reason, one of the resources that we have created, which is now available online on the OPRE website, is an appendix of all of the studies that I have been mentioning to you. So those 299 studies, they're organized by age group, and they provide you the reference for the study and also whether that study targeted co-regulation or whether it took a skills approach, and then where were effects seen, what domains of self-regulation or functioning were effects seen, and were those effects small, medium, or large. So it's quite a compendium, And if that's a tool or a resource that would be useful to you, I encourage you to take a look at it. In terms of thinking about program delivery, I think there may be a role for mental health consultants in different programs. Parenting programs, I think that there is a room for, at least what we saw in the literature, for more programs to be made more available and more accessible to more families and across more programs. And so that was one of our recommendations, is to make that available and provide that. The other recommendation has to do with addressing some of these skills within early childhood education in school settings, which I know from working in those settings for many years can be very challenging, in particular with elementary schools, in terms of thinking about the focus of the schools really being on academics, and how do we make time for something that sounds like a social emotional curriculum. I do think schools are paying attention more these days than they were 10 years ago, but when they're not paying attention, I do think we actually have a good bit of data now where we can connect some of these programs I've been talking about. We can see positive impacts on academics and learning. And so we have some of that data. We can make some of that connections. We can justify some of these programs. And we actually know that things like self-regulation are actually, if you look at long-term academic outcomes, they're actually more important than a child's IQ. It's how the child is able to self-regulate, to persist, to focus, to organize themselves, to work with others. That's actually what's going to end up predicting how successful they are in the really long term in the way that matters. And the other, I think, nice thing about some of the programs we've been talking about is that they actually fit quite well with a lot of positive behavior supports and other social emotional learning programs that schools are doing. So there's a way that those can be aligned, and I think paying attention to that can be helpful. These are some examples of what sort of skills instruction might be relevant and appropriate for preschool and school-age kids. I think I've touched upon some of this, but just to, again, I'm not going to read them, but just to sort of remind you that there's a whole range of skills that build upon each other over time, and they're very comprehensive, and we really want to make sure that we not only focus on the emotion piece, but that we focus on the emotion piece as well as the cognitive piece, and how those two things can work together. You all are probably more experts on this than I am in terms of implementing programs, but thinking about anytime you're starting new programs, and I've done this many times in my grants, which I know is a little bit of a unique setting perhaps, but that buy-in and readiness is absolutely key for good program delivery and certainly sustainability. And so thinking about how to engage tribal and spiritual leaders, and perhaps connecting this to shared goals around well-being, which I think is probably very relevant, and those connections could be made. I think training program staff is a critical, important piece. And it's part of it's about how they can help kids, but part of it is just their understanding, because I think there's an important piece in terms of how program staff and how teachers view kids when they're having trouble with self-regulation. And oftentimes I think kids with behavior challenges can be viewed as really intentionally being difficult and really being manipulative, and that's not a helpful or useful or probably even very accurate way about interpreting behavior problems in a way that's much more helpful and certainly makes a lot more sense in the way that we're talking about self-regulation is to kind of really think about it in terms of the child's skills and the child's stress. And understanding that, I think, can be really useful and really powerful to teachers and program staff. And then, of course, that piece about paying attention to, how are they manage the stress in their own lives so that then when they walk into work, when they walk into the classroom, they're actually able to be present and be supportive and be responsive to those kids. And then, of course, implementation infrastructure, which, again, you guys are probably the experts on. So a couple words on training, and then I just have a couple more slides, so nearing the end here. Training for program staff. So I mentioned how important it can be to really increase this understanding of self-regulation and how stress and adversity can really contribute to behavior problems. But even using that metaphor of literacy that I mentioned before may be something that would be useful. So it can develop. The child simply doesn't have these skills. Now, most teachers, certainly in an elementary school, if a child is having trouble reading, the teacher, for the most part, I would hope, would be willing to sit down with the child and give him extra time and attention to help him learn how to read. Well, hopefully, ideally, that same thing would be true of a child whose self-regulation skill development is delayed. Hopefully, the approach is that the teacher is willing to put in extra time and support and interventions that may be needed instead of throwing a bunch of consequences at that child. Training the staff to do the coaching and teaching. I'm going to talk about the coaching in just a minute. Thinking about co-regulation, you can think about this actually at the agency level as well. So you could take what I've been talking about today and you can think about how is your agency set up in terms of the climate and in terms of the experiences that families and communities have when they come in and they interact in your environment and with your agency staff. Supporting staff's own self-regulation skills. There's some folks who are doing some very nice work in this area. I know one area that some colleagues are working in is actually looking at how mindfulness helps teachers. How can it help staff? There's some studies looking at Head Start teachers. I think several of you work in that setting and looking at actually how high the stress levels are for those staff. And if we're thinking about asking them to play this role for kids, we absolutely have to be thinking about how do we support them with their own stress and what do we need to do to help them with their own self-regulation skills so they can be there and serve in the role for the kids the way we'd like them to. So things like public kudos, things like reflective supervision, those sorts of things are going to be may be helpful. Okay, so I think my last point here is around self-regulation coaching. I've referenced this, but I wanted to just give you a few examples sort of all together. So this idea that there may be kids might be prompted in a particular situation to pause and take a breath, or to walk away, or to use their words and tell someone how they feel instead of hitting them or grabbing something out of their hand. To help the child anticipate when things are going to be difficult. So use the example of a transition. So that may be something that could be anticipated, that's going to be a difficult situation. So let's see if there can be a plan built around how to manage that situation in a way that will help the child self-regulate better. And then, of course, a caregiver there to help support that plan. Even when kids are in preschool, they actually can get a lot out of role playing. So actually practicing a situation. Let's say your friend has this and you want to play with it too. What would you do? Let's practice. Let's imagine that you were really angry and upset. How could you go into your turtle shell to calm down? Okay, let's actually, make a turtle shell and practice using it right now. So all of those kinds of role play types of things. But then very much this component of actually being there, being present, and monitoring the child to support the child and scaffold the child, and then, following up and praising and reinforcing the child. And that, of course, can be individualized in there's certain ways of doing that work for some kids and not others. So we always have to consider that when we think about praise and reinforcement. And then, of course, helping kids solve problems, and when one solution doesn't work, helping them come up with a backup plan or an alternative solution. Okay, so this is, I think, my last content slide here before wrapping up. I've touched upon this point of personal self-regulation skills for staff, and so I wanted to just reiterate one more time that what I'm talking about here are things like stress management and coping skills. I've mentioned mindfulness as one example. Problem solving, stressors in their own life could be a piece of that. So those would be some things that you might think about. And then you might think about really encouragement and support for doing things like in that stressful situation with that child, were they able to pause before they reacted to the child and notice their own feelings and do something about it, take their own pause before they interact with the child so that they can do that in a way that's going to be useful and effective. How can they stay calm? And how can they view some of these problem behaviors through a trauma-focused lens or thinking about stress and self-regulation. So final recommendations for tribal communities and American Indian, Alaskan Native populations. Consider co-regulation as an intervention framework to strengthen resilience and promote well-being, and really connecting that to cultural beliefs and values. Considering these benefits for traditional cultural practices, I think there's a lot of potential and value, and Dr. Setlakai can probably speak with us in a few moments about some of her ideas around that. But a lot of potential there and a lot of work needed to kind of connect those two things. And for the programs we do have, of course, really considering those what those cultural adaptations need to be, and of course supporting caregivers. So you guys have probably gotten my key points here. So here's the resources I've mentioned. The first three of these reports are posted on the ACF OPRE website. I mentioned the appendix, and then we'll have a series of briefs, and one of the briefs that we're working on actually with some of the folks from the Native Children's Research Exchange is a brief on self-regulation for tribal communities. So that in particular may be one that you all might want to look out for. We're going to be doing one on early childhood. We already have one out on adolescents, doing one on research gaps and some age-specific fact sheets. So you're certainly welcome to contact me if you have specific questions, but a lot of this is out and the rest will be forthcoming soon. So I think I'm a little bit over my time for presentation, but we have about 15 minutes, I think, for Q&A. So I guess folks will be unmuted.
Yeah, so Brad is going to go ahead and unmute all of the participants. So we're really going to depend on each of you to mute your lines unless you're speaking. And please don't use your hold button. That's when we get the muzak that we heard at the very beginning. Use 4* to mute yourself. And if you have a question, just press 4* again to unmute and ask your question. So Brad, do you want to go ahead and unmute everybody? And so when you hear you're unmuted, if you can just automatically hit 4* to mute yourself. I think I'm hearing the unmuting happening. So thank you so much, Desiree. You've given a lot of food for thought here, and this concept, naming it self-regulation and co-regulation may be a new term, but I think so much of what you shared to me is stuff that can be, in the best circumstances, also kind of, automatic, if you will, the natural things that we do as parents or caregivers to help our children in difficult emotional or behavioral situations. So thank you for giving us this lens to think about children and, our interactions with them. I have a chance to talk to you a lot, so I really want to give this time to our participants to share any reflections or ask questions of you. So please just feel free to speak up and share a reflection or a question. Hello?
Hi. My name is Becca. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I appreciate it. I'm new to webinars here, and I want to go back into this webinar and click on some of the links that you have provided. Can I do that after this? Can I go back onto the slides?
So we're going to do a recording, but we'll send out all the slides. I think we can send out a slide. I don't think you can click in this format, but Desiree, would it be okay if we shared your slides with everyone?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And, I know it's hard to write down a web link. I turned to that page. I know it's a little tricky, but it's actually, if you Google self-regulation and toxic stress and Desiree Murray, you actually get there pretty quickly.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Very good. Thank you so much.
Well, I had a question for you, Desiree.
Okay.
So you had said early on, you referenced rewards and consequences, and then you also said something a little bit later about, you want to be careful either as a teacher or caregiver parent that you're not doing a lot with consequences. And I think that's an easy place to go because it's a fast way to get children to self-regulate, if you will. So I was wondering if you could say more about, what you mean by that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So rewards and consequences, they're helpful in a lot of ways. They can absolutely sort of, I think in terms of our model, they really kind of fit into that motivation piece, and also they sometimes help make rules and expectations more salient when we use rewards and consequences. But there's also so many ways to misuse them. There's issues, there's developmental issues, for example. So I was talking with a family member with my daughter whose 2-year-old is being sent to timeout, which is not developmentally helpful for most 2-year-olds in terms of learning from consequences, because the ability to connect behavior and consequences is very limited, and that connection is lost in a matter of moments or certainly a minute. And so the reason we use consequences is hopefully that the child will learn to make a different choice, or in the example of timeout, because we need to make a situation safe and there's a concern of danger. But there's also this concern of using consequences in a way that's not developmentally appropriate, and that perhaps a child's actually not yet at a place where they can learn from consequences. And kids have a lot of individual variability with that younger kid. But I would also say there's developmental pieces in adolescence. So, for example, one of the things we know from brain research on adolescents is that they are hugely sensitive to rewards, and actually much less sensitive to consequences, which is sort of backwards sometimes of what we might think with teenagers. Well, if I just give them a bigger consequence. If I just take this away or do that, maybe he'll really learn this time. Actually, if you look at the brain research and some of the sort of laboratory experiments, it's actually the rewards that are much more likely to change behavior. So there's some of these developmental pieces that come into play, and then there's the whole piece around the individual child characteristics, and there is not any one reward or consequence that's going to work for all kids. And there is often a trial and error or really getting to know the child process in order to identify something that's meaningful and salient. So yes, consequences and rewards can be very useful. They can be very effective, but they also sort of require some real understanding and thinking through so that they can be used well. Did I address your question?
Yes. Any other reflections or questions for Dr. Murray while we have her here for a few more minutes? I'm just curious for those of you.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I have a question of actually more about the PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
So are you saying, Dr. Murray, that that's on your site? If we need a copy, because I couldn't get a copy of that. The way our things are set up here, I was working at two different stations, so because I had the audio here and the visual over there. So I wasn't, I don't know if I can download the PowerPoint.
So what we can do is we can we have all of your emails, all of you who are on the call today. We'll follow up and send a PDF of the slides because on our website we post a recording of the webinar, but we'll send a PDF to everybody on this call today so you have all of these wonderful resources.
Great. Thank you so much.
Monica, any reflections? I referenced you several times, so I thought you might have some.
Monica may be on mute. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
Hello?
Oh, hi, Monica.
Yeah, I kept pressing *4 and it wasn't doing anything, so I apologize. But I did want to say thank you, Desiree, for really working hard to bring culture in. And we were just at the Head Start conference, ACF Head Start conference, and we were at Clancy's talk on self-regulation. And I was sitting with Jackie Height, who's one of our Head Start directors and collaborators, and she was pushing me to ask Clancy where culture fits in here and where cultural practices fit in here. And she was disappointed in me because I wouldn't get up and say anything. But I just felt like, well, we know the state of the literature. There hasn't been much attention to how cultural practices may shape self-regulatory skills or are co-regulatory. Many of them really emphasize co-regulation and helping children learn their place and learn when they can speak and when not to speak, and they really have to exercise those core executive function skills. And so that's where my work is really focused on, looking at how active participation in cultural practices shapes those basic cognitive skills that we call executive functions.
Yeah.
So we don't have a lot of research out there to support that, and I'm just starting my study to develop that research foundation. And I was curious if any of the participants out there had any reflections on how they think cultural practices may help shape self-regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Hello?
Maybe we lost
We're all.
Hi. I have a
Hello.
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. I'm sorry. I am a new site supervisor and teacher at a Tribal Head Start program, and I'm wondering how do I approach the tribe regarding cultural and traditional methods of self-regulation and co-regulation.
In terms of how do you approach the tribe to get support for bringing culture into the curriculum, or?
Exactly. Yeah. What is the best way to do that? Would I just go to the tribal office and say, this is what I want. I want to know what you guys do regarding regulation and co-regulation, or what are your traditions or your practices?
Mm-hmm.
I'm
you have,
and I haven't had my Head Start training yet, nor my crib training yet. That's all coming up. So starting with webinars. So that's my question. How do I approach them?
Well, from my experience, I usually work with the directors of education if they have an education director in place to talk to them about how they're bringing culture into the classroom. So some tribes have education directors, some don't. But that's where I would start. Does anybody else have any suggestions?
Well, you said you were new to Head Start, did you say?
I am new. Yes, I came in as a long-term site supervisor, and they just hired me on, and I'm beginning my training beginning on the 29th. So I haven't learned everything yet, but since we're on the topic, it's like, how can I approach my tribe?
Well, have you connected to the National Indian Head Start Directors Association? They have an annual training conference, and it's a large association of tribal Head Start directors, programs, and staff. And I would think that you would have a lot of colleagues, knowledge and expertise to draw on, because infusing tribal Head Start programs with tribal culture and language practices, it's really critical to so many and is really a priority to so many tribal Head Start programs. So I would really encourage you to connect with that group. Are you familiar with NISHDA?
No. Can you repeat the name again?
Yes, it's the National Indian Head Start Directors Association, NIHSDA. And they just had their annual conference, training conference, their big one. They have one every year. It was in D.C. this past June, and I'm not remembering. It's going to be in Denver next June, actually. And so every other year it's in D.C., and then the other years it's some other location across the country. There's also, I don't know where you're located, but there's, various within Tribal Head Start, there are various regional conferences as well. So there's a Southwest Consortium conference that's focused on Head Start and children's development, tribal children's development. And it's called the Southwest Consortium. I don't know if they have a website, but there's a lot of thinking and thought about how culture and language practices can be brought into settings like tribal Head Start programs.
I have a suggestion. I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, this is Sally, and I've worked at a Native Head Start for 26 years, and I think one of the best ways is we have a cultural department, and through the Business Council, we have I'm with the Lummi tribe, and so I think I'm non-native, so I felt like at first I'm a visitor, to this tribe, to this area. I don't want to come on too strong. So I would contact even other staff that have been around for a long time. I ask them for their advice. I I'm just trying to, I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say. Like, yeah, I don't know if the tribe that you work for has a cultural department, and I think that would be the first place I would go to get some advice and to explain, what you've learned and how it can help the children. But yeah, and
Wonderful.
that's where I would start.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your advice. All of you.
So I know we're out of time here, but I just there were a few questions, and for those of you who asked the questions, we'll be following up by email, and you'll be able to respond to my email. We can connect you with Dr. Murray. And those questions really briefly were from an early learning programs perspective, what would be the one point you would hope that we should take away with us? And I think, Desiree, I'm totally putting you on the spot to pick the one point that you would leave people with, but maybe we can end with that, and it kind of tied into one of my questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think for early learning programs, the key point is to support the caregivers in that program so that they can fully provide sort of all the things that we would think of in terms of co-regulation support.
I think that's a great point to end on. Obviously, how you do that takes a lot of work and resources, and we hope that some that were highlighted in your talk today will be a good resource. So thank you, everyone. I will be following up with a PDF of the slides. And again, you'll have my email, and you'll see Dr. Murray's email and Dr. Setlakai in that communication. And please do reach out to us if you have questions about how this work applies in your programs. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Murray and Dr. Setlakai.
You're welcome.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.